It's the 30th of June, 1559. Things go terribly wrong on this day. Henry II, King of France, was celebrating the conclusion of the Italian Wars and the marriage of his daughter to Philip II, King of Spain. To show off his virility, he decided to personally participate in a joust. As his opponent's lance fragmented upon contact, a shard of wood penetrated King Henry's visor and impacted itself straight through his eye and into his brain. This became the first act in a tragedy to last 3 generations. After Henry's death, his son Francis II, a frail boy of 15, is next in line. As fate had it, his uncles, Francois, the Duke of Guise, and Charles of Guise, the Cardinal of Lorraine, were exactly in the right place and at the right time to take advantage of this. The Guises were originally from Lorraine and entered French service in the time of Francis I. They served France with distinction. However, their main merit is their marriage into the Scottish royal house, allies of France since time immemorial. Mary, Queen of Scots, their niece, is wife to Francis II, the current King of France. Thus, the Guises, who are already powerful, are propelled to the most prominent position. After Henry's death, they deftly persuade the young king to let them manage his affairs, and use this power to isolate him from the rest of the court. Catherine of Medici, the Queen Mother, is separated from her son. Anne de Montmorency, a veteran of the Italian Wars, who used to be the number 1 at court, is sent away. Antoine of Navarre from the House of Bourbon, a prince of the blood directly related to the Valois kings of France, and who thus should be the number 1 at court, is sent on a fool's errand to the south. Louis of Bourbon, Prince of Condé, Navarre's brother, and Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France and nephew of Montmorency, are also sidelined. But court intrigue is only part of the story. Religion, or rather ideology, makes the Guises' usurpation of power especially unacceptable. By 1559, France is already spiraling out of control. Protestantism had reached France as early as 1519. However, it had been preceded by humanism that acted as a moderating force. Francis I, a materialistically minded man, condoned it, failing to recognize its significance. Thus, Protestantism spread, quietly and in an innocuous manner. Things changed forever with the affair of the placards. On the morning of the 18th of October, 1534, the people of Paris and a number of large cities were greeted by placards laid out in strategic places by radical Protestants. The placards condemned the Catholic Mass and said that those partaking in it, meaning pretty much everyone, were corrupt, dumb, and forsaken to hell. Moreover, they contained mild criticism of the king. Worst of all, one of these placards was found nailed to the door of the king's bedchamber. Francis knew sedition when he saw it, and to the great delight of the offended masses, he declared a war on heresy. Those believed responsible for the affront were swiftly burned at the stake. Persecution became nationwide, as Protestants either went underground or fled France altogether. One of those fleeing was a young lawyer by the name of John Calvin. Calvin first fled to Basel, then headed to Strasbourg, and finally settled in Geneva. Here he formulated his doctrine, taking elements from both Luther and Zwingli. What makes his version of Protestantism particularly potent is Calvin's concern with worldly issues. Unlike Luther, Calvin believed that the state should be subordinated to the church's moral desires. After he gained control of Geneva, Calvin implemented his plan, purging the city of all vices, replacing them with virtue and industry. Needless to say, this inspired many, most notably the upwardly mobile middle classes of the ever-expanding cities. But it wasn't only the middle classes who were converted. This new strain of Protestantism also inspired the highest ranks of French society, most notably the Admiral Gaspard de Coligny and the Prince of Condé. Opposing them are the Guises, the champions of Catholicism in France. Their power is a direct threat to men such as Condé and Coligny. Already during the reign of Henry II, persecution of heretics intensified, and now with the Guises in charge, there is serious talk of introducing a Spanish-style Inquisition. But even though merely being a Protestant is punishable by death, Protestantism keeps growing and growing. Calvin had originally built his power on exiles from France. Now hundreds and thousands of these exiles are returning to France as Calvinist preachers. By 1560, it's estimated that 2 million out of France's population of 16 million are Protestants. As the repression increases throughout 1559, there are more and more calls for something to be done. Aside from questions of belief, the government of the Guises is increasingly unpopular on other fronts too. After 6 decades of fighting the Habsburgs for supremacy, France is bankrupt beyond belief. The national debt amounts to 4 times the yearly income, and many soldiers and functionaries haven't been paid in years. Banditry and crime skyrocket. This is when a group of Protestants decide to take the law into their own hands. Their plan calls for a small group of elite soldiers to descend on the court, disarm the guards, arrest the Guises, and take the king under their protection. But as the plan progresses, the number of participants in the plot also keeps swelling. Inevitably, people start to talk, and the authorities find out. Alarmed by this, Catherine of Medici attempts to propose concessions. But the plot is already underway, as thousands of suspicious persons gather around Amboise, where the court is residing. Being well prepared, the Guises offer a robust response, rounding up most of the conspirators. To Catherine's urging, the king offers them clemency in return for peace. But a few days later, the plotters try again. This time, the Guises are given a free hand. 1,200 Protestants are hunted down and put to death. Contrary to expectations, this only makes things worse. Protestants start to arm themselves. Violent insurrections and riots break out all across France. The worst cases are in the Occitan region in the south, the heartland of the Bourbons. This is not surprising, since centuries ago this was the land of the Cathars, and later the Waldensians. But other regions also side with the Protestants. All the way from Lyon through Provence, through the Loire Valley and into Normandy, countless towns and cities side with the Protestants. This Calvinist crescent is opposed by the eastern regions of France and the city of Paris, strongholds of the Guises and staunchly Catholic. When civil war seems almost inevitable, Catherine of Medici and her party called the Politiques step onto the scene. According to their detractors, the Politiques are Machiavellians and opportunists. However, Catherine and her acolytes believe that anything is better than war. When the old chancellor dies, Catherine nominates her man, Michel de l'Hôpital, to the post. To the ire of the Guises, l'Hôpital suspends the persecution of Protestants pending a national religious council that would decide the direction of religious matters. This makes a lot of sense, taking into account France's special position within the church. Unlike in Tudor England, the French monarchs already have extensive control over the church. The king nominates the bishops and archbishops, who are usually his clientele, allowing the monarchy to pilfer the church's extensive resources and set the agenda almost at will. With such control, moderate reforms implemented by a strong king would be the logical step. But with a boy king in charge and the monarchy in disarray, this proves to be an impossible task. To counter the Queen Mother's centrism, the Guises moved to undermine the Protestant side. In October, the Prince of Condé is arrested on suspicion of taking part in the conspiracy of Amboise. In spite of the evidence being merely circumstantial, the Guises plan to condemn Condé for sedition and have him executed as soon as possible. But events again take a radical turn. On the 5th of December 1560, Francis II dies of an ear infection after a mere 17 months on the throne. As he had no children, he's followed by his brother Charles IX, who is only 10 years old. As Francis's death had not been sudden as in the case of Henry, Catherine of Medici had ample time to prepare. As soon as her second son is crowned, she sidelines the Guises and assumes governorship herself. To give this move legitimacy, she invites Antoine de Bourbon, the King of Navarre, to act as co-regent. Navarre himself is leaning towards Protestantism, however officially he is still Catholic. The Kingdom of Navarre, his rightful domain, had been annexed by Spain during the Italian Wars. By allying himself with the moderate Catholics, he naively hopes that Philip II will return his kingdom. Condé is also included in the government, after all charges against him are dropped. Anne de Montmorency is also courted by Catherine, who uses his personal animosity with the Duke of Guise to get him on board. Thus the Guise and their radical Catholic party are almost entirely removed from power. With this new impetus, L'Hôpital proposes a national religious council to settle matters of the faith, and an Estates Générales, the assembly of the French Parliament, to remedy the kingdom's finances. Of these two, the religious council proves to be the most problematic. The Council of Trent is already underway, therefore the Pope tries everything to prevent this, fearing a repetition of the English Reformation of Henry VIII. Nonetheless, both events are underway by autumn 1561. At the Estates Générales, it's decided that the Church will voluntarily surrender a great deal of its income and property to the king, giving a critical lifeline to the bankrupt monarchy. The religious council, the Colloquy of Poissy, proves to be much less successful. Charles of Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, proposes that the Calvinist Protestants adopt the Lutheran Confession of Augsburg as a basis for a compromise. Being intransigent, the Protestants refuse this, insisting that Calvinism should simply be allowed to coexist side by side with the established faith. The talks collapse, but Catherine is undismayed. As a private initiative, she convenes a small group of moderate Catholics and moderate Protestants to hammer out a compromise, whatever it takes. A compromise of sorts is eventually achieved. By the Edict of January, the Protestants are given unprecedented liberties. They are now allowed to freely attend services anywhere excluding Paris, provided they congregate outside city limits in a makeshift place that may not be a church. In return, they must promise to lay down arms and keep the peace. This measure is meant to be only temporary, pending the results of the Council of Trent. But in spite of this liberal compromise, things only get worse. Neither Catholics nor Protestants are happy with their settlement, each wanting more at the expense of the other. Protestants become more brazen, as radical Calvinist exiles from Geneva and Germany flood into the country. In some places where Protestants are the majority, Catholics are unceremoniously evicted from their church. In other places, Protestants engage in violent acts of iconoclasm, scandalizing mainstream public opinion. Even in staunchly Catholic Paris, Protestants are openly practicing their faith, proselytizing without regard for the majority. This is too much for moderate Catholics such as Montmorency. Putting aside his personal differences, he joins the Duke of Guise and the Marshal Saint-André to form the Triumvirate, a militant Catholic alliance designed to combat heresy. Their greatest ally in this is Philip II, King of Spain. Philip faces the same problem in the Low Countries, the richest of his provinces. If France were to descend into Calvinism, it's feared that the Netherlands will also explode in a Protestant rebellion. Therefore, the Catholic party is assured that as soon as they make up their mind to crush the Calvinists, Spain's vast military resources will be at their disposal. The Protestants also attempt to find allies abroad. Their champion is Elizabeth I, the Protestant Queen of England. They also make inroads to the Protestant princes of Germany. However, their position is much more difficult, as Elizabeth is ever cautious to intervene. Likewise, the German princes, in spite of having inexhaustible numbers of mercenaries after the Schmalkaldic Wars, lack the money to engage in decisive action. This is the precarious situation in France at the beginning of 1562. Civil war is almost a certainty. All that is needed is a spark to ignite the fire. This casus belli finally comes on the 1st of March 1562. On this day, a group of Protestants gather to worship in a barn outside the small town of Vassy. They are not doing anything illegal, however where they do it is far more problematic. Vassy is only a stone's throw from Joinville, the headquarters of the Guise. When the Duke of Guise arrives to Vassy with a large retinue, a scuffle ensues between his men and the Protestants. The scuffle turns into a skirmish, and the skirmish turns into a massacre. The Protestant civilians are no match for the Duke's men-at-arms, and a great number of them are mercilessly cut down. By now, this is nothing out of the ordinary in France. What makes this massacre special is the media frenzy that follows it. From Germany to Spain, countless numbers of pamphlets are printed by each side, claiming the other was responsible for the massacre. 2 weeks later, when the Duke of Guise arrives in Paris, he is welcomed as a hero. The scandalized Catholic masses side with him to the last man. Sometime later, Condé also attempts to enter Paris at the head of 3,000 horsemen. However, by this time, Paris already resembles an armed camp. The king and the queen mother are at Fontainebleau at this time. Catherine still hopes to calm the situation, but her pleas fall on deaf ears. Several massacres of Protestants occur throughout France, and this only escalates the situation further. Realizing that war is inevitable, Condé races to Fontainebleau to secure the king. However, the Catholics get there first, and carry away the young king and his court to Paris. Seeing this, the Protestants elect Condé as their leader, with Coligny as his deputy. The Huguenots arm themselves and repel to Orléans, the largest city of the Loire Valley, and begin to provision themselves for a long war. Thus begins the First French War of Religion. It's April 1562. The whole of France is up in arms. After the massacre at Vassy and the seizure of the king and his court by the Guises, war seems inevitable. Condé occupies Orléans, as countless towns and cities also fall to the Protestants. In Rouen, Le Havre, Tours and Lyon, Protestant fifth columnists overpower the Catholics. Condé is elected supreme commander and protector of the Huguenot cause. Using his strong position in the Loire Valley, he hopes to isolate the Protestant heartland in the southwest from staunchly Catholic Paris and the northeast. Paris is also cut off from the sea, as the Protestants in Rouen control the Seine. However, in Guyenne and Burgundy, the Catholics manage to retain control. This way, the Protestant enclaves themselves are separated from one another. This is the difficult strategic situation in France in the spring of 1562. Mobilization soon begins in earnest. As this is a civil war, both armies draw from the pre-existing units and resources of the realm. The French military at this time is second to none, being the result of 60 years of almost continuous warfare. A series of victories and defeats honed its skills to the maximum. As most armies of Western Europe, the French military is also based on combined arms formations, a close cooperation of pike and shot, cavalry and artillery. Its main striking force is represented by the gendarmes. The gendarmes are armoured head to toe in state-of-the-art plate armour. The horses of those fighting in the front ranks are also encased in armour. Most of the gendarmes are members of the nobility, trained from childhood to ride horses and charge with a lance. They are the oldest and proudest class of the professional military, being founded during the darkest days of the 100 Years' War. In peacetime, there are around 7,000 gendarmes, formed into lances comprising of 2 to 3 men-at-arms, who are supported by an equal number of mounted archers or arquebusiers. They are complemented, and in some cases supplanted, by the newest branch of the cavalry, the reiters. The reiters are mostly from Germany, and are the result of the recent advances in technology. With the advent of the wheel lock and the snap lock, firearms have gotten more compact, allowing their use from horseback. Instead of a lance, the reiters charge in with a pair of pistols and fire them from close range, making these compact weapons as effective as a full-size musket. Unlike the gendarmes, the reiters wear cheaper, mass-produced three-quarter armour, allowing them more tactical flexibility, but also a reasonable staying power. Cavalry makes up a fifth to a third of contemporary French armies. Even though cavalry is the main striking force, ever since the pike and shot revolution of the early 16th century, infantry has become the backbone of the army. The infantry is made up of 3 contingents. The most prominent of these are the Swiss. The Swiss have been incorporated into French armies even before the Italian Wars, and have traditionally formed the core of the infantry. They are lightly armoured and fight in a tight formation with a 6-meter long pike and a longsword. They're equally good in defense and offense, and are renowned for their resilience and bravery. The Swiss are somewhat handicapped by a reluctance to adopt firearms, these soldiers only making up a tenth of their formations. The Swiss are complemented by Landsknechts. German soldiers who are originally modelled on the Swiss. The Landsknechts are known for their colourful dress and flexibility on the battlefield. Like the Swiss, they fight in a tight formation with a long pike and a sword. However, unlike the Swiss, they have a sizable contingent of musketeers and arquebusiers within their ranks. Landsknechts are inferior in courage and unit cohesion when compared to the Swiss. However, they are able to mitigate this by a clever combination of pikes and firearms. Additionally to these foreign troops, there's also a contingent of French infantry. The first of these formations was established by Francis I in the 1530s, who modelled them on the Landsknechts. Similarly to the Landsknechts, they fight in tight formations with an even higher ratio of muskets to pikes. As far as discipline and effectiveness are concerned, these can vary to a large degree. Veteran regiments can be as good as the Landsknechts, while newly established ones a little better than city militias. Additionally to these two arms, there is also the world-class French artillery. The French have been among the first to establish a professional corps of artillery. Their guns are manned by full-time soldiers, and have proven decisive not only in sieges, but also in fully fledged battles like at Ravenna. Thus, the quality and availability of soldiers is no issue for either side. The logistics of gathering up and paying the armies, however, proves to be far more challenging. Most active duty forces are concentrated on the border regions of France, protecting the country from the Habsburg lands that surround it. Mustering all these soldiers to where they're needed will take months. Getting the indispensable Swiss and German contingents will take even longer. Moving the artillery proves to be the most daunting task, as thousands of teamsters and pioneers need to be hired to shift the guns, powder and shot. And all of this has to be done on a shoestring budget, the kingdom being bankrupt since the death of King Henry. To mitigate their poverty, the royalists appeal to the bankers and merchants of Paris, as well as foreign aid from Spain and the Pope. The Protestants themselves first seize all regular incomes from the regions they control, and supplement this with the confiscation of church property, as well as generous donations from an extensive network of Calvinist congregations. French units are split down the middle. Most Protestants join the Protestant cause, while those who are Catholic, as well as a small number of Calvinists who hold the law supreme, join the royalist side. Recruitment of foreign regiments is less direct, being handled by local agents of the French crown. As most of these mercenary captains remain loyal to the king, their side has the advantage in the long run. The Protestants are more efficient in the short term, quickly amassing decisive numbers at Orléans. However, due to Condé's indecision, they squander this initial advantage, holding back for months in their defensive positions. While the logistics are being sorted out, both sides engage in a savage war of vitriolic propaganda. The Protestants insist that far from being rebels, they are the true representatives of the king, only meant to rescue him from foreign usurpers, namely the Guises. Far from being intransigent, they claim to be on the right side of the religious debate, advocating for full toleration of the new faith. The Catholics, on the other hand, claim to be certain that the Protestant rebellion is solely motivated by a malicious desire of Condé and Coligny to become kings themselves. Moreover, they state that Calvinism as an ideology is inherently rebellious and anti-monarchical, as the conspiracy of Amboise clearly shows. A large portion of this propaganda is directed at the German princes, who control the recruitment of Landsknechts and reiters, indispensable for both sides. In spite of the Catholics' efforts to dissuade the mostly Lutheran princes from helping the Calvinist French, both sides managed to recruit soldiers from Germany. As the propaganda and the preparation for war continue, Catherine and her centrist party make a last effort to obtain a negotiated peace, but to no avail. Saber rattling and the gears of war in motion drown out their voice. By June, the royalist side is ready for war. Large numbers of Swiss and Germans have gathered around Paris. The French cavalry and infantry have mustered, and the artillery is ready to go. Anne de Montmorency is put in overall command, with the Duke of Guise and Saint-André as his lieutenants. In July 1562, the Catholic army moves into the Loire Valley. They outnumber the Protestants almost 2-1, so the initial engagements easily go their way. By September, the cities of Tours and Bourges are taken. The war had barely started, and the Protestants are already on the back foot. But just as the royalists are preparing to march on Orleans, two things happen. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, has finally made up her mind to answer the Protestants' cry for help, be it partly motivated by selfish interests. In October, an English contingent numbering 6,000 lands at Huguenot-controlled Le Havre. The French Protestants hand over the keys to the city that the English intend to hold as a pawn until Calais is restored to England. Perceiving this as a more urgent issue, the Royalist War Council decides to lead a sizable blocking force around Orleans and head into Normandy with the main force, to oust the English and to reduce Rouen. With no help coming from the English, Rouen is eventually captured by October and afterwards savagely sacked. Antoine de Bourbon, the King of Navarre, is mortally wounded during the siege, the first of the commanders to exit the stage. While this is going on, the Protestants again receive an uplift. François d'Andelot, Gaspard de Coligny's brother, returns to France with a large force of reiters and landsknechts that he recruited in Germany. The Catholics again have to split their forces, as Saint-André races with a blocking force to meet them. But in spite of Saint-André's efforts, d'Andelot manages to evade him, joining up with his comrades in Orleans. But even so, the Protestants are still outnumbered. The Royalists conclude that as the year is almost done, there will be no more significant action until next spring. To this end, they send part of their army home, leaving a sizable force to block the Protestants in Orleans, while the Duke of Guise remains in the north with another detachment to besiege the English. This way, the Catholics hope that the Protestants will run out of money, and their foreign mercenaries will desert them. But in December, Condé surprises everyone. He gathers his forces and in an all-or-nothing move, marches on Paris. With the capital thus threatened, Guise abandons the siege of Le Havre and races back to the capital. Formerly demobilized soldiers are now called back, and citizen militias begin to fortify the city. In this desperate situation, Condé is plausibly close to taking the city. But instead of doing this, he chooses to set up camp several miles from Paris and wait. Seeing this indecision, Catherine of Medici sallies forth to negotiate. But this, of course, is merely a trick. 2 weeks of fruitless talks give Guise and Montmorency time to concentrate a decisive force in Paris. Soon, Condé becomes the hunted. Faced by a superior royalist force, he is now compelled to break camp and retreat. Now, the only logical thing is to move into Normandy to unite with the English. To this end, the Protestant army begins to move north, but on the 19th of December 1562, their way is blocked by a large royalist army just south of the town of Dreux. The Catholics have around 19,000 soldiers against the Protestants' 13,000. They are stronger in infantry, but weaker in terms of cavalry. To allay this inferiority in horse, the Catholics position themselves in a long line between the villages of Blainville and Epinay, being flanked by woods and streams on both sides. The royalist left is led by the commander himself, and de Montmorency. Montmorency positions his cavalry on the extreme left, and his French infantry and Swiss pikemen towards the centre. The right flank of the army is commanded by Saint-André. He splits his cavalry between the flank and the centre, with French infantry and landsknechts holding the line. The Duke of Guise remains hidden behind the right flank with the Spanish infantry and a group of gendarmes. The Huguenot army is commanded by Condé on the left and Coligny on the right. They both position the gendarmes and the reiters, their main striking force, in the front. Landsknechts and French infantry make up the second line, with additional cavalry further back in reserve. Initially, none of the armies seem ready to fight. Men on both sides have friends and relatives in the opposing force. After facing down each other for 2 hours, the Catholics make the first move. In fear of losing the initiative, the Protestants also attack. In the first move, Coligny's horsemen fall on the Catholic right. They make quick work of the inferior royalist cavalry, then turn around to attack the infantry. The French infantry quickly breaks, however the Swiss stand firm. After this, Coligny's cavalry turns to pursue the fleeing Catholic horse. Reaching their enemy's camp, they fall upon it and begin to loot the baggage. Coligny attempts to rally them, but without much success. During the attack, Montmorency, the Catholic army's commander, is captured and immediately spirited away. Meanwhile, Condé himself moves to exploit this local victory. He sends his infantry in a group of reiters to block the royalist right, then turns to assault the already weakened Swiss with his cavalry. But the Swiss are far from finished. Cavalry charge after cavalry charge is repulsed as they continue to stand firm. After these attacks, their arch-enemies, the Landsknechts, move in from the right. The Swiss fall upon them with all their fury, forcing the Landsknechts to withdraw towards Blainville. Condé now gathers all his cavalry and throws them against the Swiss in a desperate last charge. But all this manages to do is push the Swiss slightly back towards the centre. At this crucial moment, Saint-André and Guise go on the attack. Their Landsknechts and veteran French infantry sweep away the Huguenots' inexperienced French infantry. When the Duke of Guise attacks with his fresh gendarmes and Spanish infantry, the Landsknechts either yield or die on the spot. The Reiters are also forced to flee. Condé attempts a desperate charge, but his men are cut down and he is taken prisoner. In the last act, Coligny, who finally managed to rally his gendarmes, makes a failed attempt to rescue the situation. He charges the Catholic lines, but to no avail. The masses of Catholic infantry repulses every attack, the only result being the capture and slaying of Marshal Saint-André. As night falls, Coligny and his remaining men are forced to retreat. By the end of the battle, at least 9,000 men are dead. The Protestants have barely any infantry left, but their cavalry is still more or less intact. This prevents the Catholic army, who have very little cavalry left, from mounting an effective pursuit. Nonetheless, the Duke of Guise, the only Catholic commander left, does all in his power to follow up on the victory. By the beginning of February 1563, the main army is besieging Orléans. D'Andelot is left to defend the beleaguered city with a handful of infantry and citizen militias. Meanwhile, Coligny mounts a chevauchée into Normandy in the vain hope of obtaining help from the English or distracting the main Catholic force. By mid-February, the situation in Orléans is hopeless. The Catholics are preparing for a final assault that will undoubtedly carry them to victory. This is when an alleged Huguenot deserter sneaks up on the Duke of Guise, fires his pistol, and mortally wounds the last Catholic commander. With Guise's death, the siege stalls, and Orléans is given a reprieve. Now that almost all the major figures are out of the game, Catherine of Medici sees a chance for peace. Ignoring that the Protestants were on the brink of defeat, Catherine strives to obtain a negotiated peace. By this, she hopes to obtain a balance of power where her party of moderates would become the kingmaker. After Condé and Montmorency are released, peace is achieved by the Edict of Amboise. The Edict of Amboise permits free worship to the nobility, all the while restricting it for commoners, who are only allowed to worship in those places that already have Huguenot congregations, and even there only in a few designated places. Church property is to be restored, and the German mercenaries are to be paid from the royal coffers. Given the outcome of the war, this settlement seems fair, but predictably none of the parties are happy with it. Resistance to the edict is initially high, with Paris and Lyon being the most reluctant. But eventually they likewise yield, as France settles into an uneasy peace. It's 1563. The vicious war that pitted Frenchmen against Frenchmen had just ended. The royalist army acquitted itself well. However, with the assassination of the Duke of Guise, the Protestants snatched victory from the jaws of defeat by obtaining a negotiated peace. Catherine of Medici and her centrist party of politiques, who were the architects of this peace, now take the lead. Catherine's idea for a lasting peace is to play off one faction against the other. Until Montmorency quarrels with the Guise, and the Guise quarrel with Condé and Coligny, Catherine can rest assured and pretend to be the only adult in the room. After the German mercenaries are gotten rid of, Catherine endeavours to unite Catholic and Protestant in a common cause. In May 1563, the united French army marches against the English, who still occupy Le Havre. The English are ousted by August, and subsequently Catherine makes her next move. To cement her power, the 13-year-old Charles IX is declared an adult. This way, no one can have formal influence over the king, but Catherine can still exercise her informal motherly control. To show the provinces their power, Catherine and her son embark on a grand tour of France. The royal progress is planned to take 2 years, giving Catherine and the court ample time to hear all grievances and pacify all quarrels. Starting from Fontainebleau, the court first covers the east and southeast of the country. To her dismay, Catherine discovers that the country is still up in arms. All her divisive peace has achieved is more discontent. Catholics who feel cheated by the peace begin to arm themselves. They set up regional leagues, intended to do what an impotent government won't. In response to the Catholic leagues, the Protestants also set up their armed groups. Catherine does her best to quench the flames, but all this does is hide the problem. By 1565, the royal progress reaches the southern city of Bayonne. Here, Catherine meets with the Duke of Alba, the representative of the King of Spain. The talks are tense, as there is already much friction between France and Spain. Philip II wants the French to take a much harder stance on heresy, as he fears that the rebellion from France could easily spread into the Low Countries. Alba insists that the French should immediately implement the findings of the Council of Trent and take the fight to the Protestants. Catherine insists that compromise is the best solution, and that Spain should stay out of France's business. The Duke of Alba leaves empty-handed as the court continues its progress northward. But the conference has further ramifications. To Alba's insistence, the Protestants were not invited. This spawns a series of conspiracy theories referring to what really took place at the meeting. The most radical Protestants allege that Catholic France and Catholic Spain are planning their demise. When a wave of iconoclasm breaks out in Flanders in the summer of 1566, these rumours gain even more ground. Philip II fears that his governor had lost control of the province. To rectify this, he orders the Duke of Alba to raise a large army of veterans in Italy, then take these troops north to intervene in the Low Countries. 10,000 men are gathered by 1567, to be joined by further contingents from Germany. In June, Alba begins his march. The route, later to be known as the Spanish Road, takes him through Savoy, into the county of Burgundy, through Lorraine and Luxembourg, finally arriving in Flanders. This is dangerously close to France. Catherine knows that this procession may well instigate the Protestants to rebellion. Therefore, the kingdom preemptively hires 6,000 Swiss mercenaries to guard the border. Eventually, Alba reaches the Netherlands without issue. However, the Swiss are not disbanded. Even though the Crown insists that this is merely a precaution, the Protestants are convinced that this force is about to be used against them. Something must be done. To this end, the Protestants gather 1,500 horsemen in total secrecy, intended to capture the king and his court to liberate them from Catholic conspirators. Unlike at Amboise, this plot is only found out once it's already in progress. The court is at Meurs near Paris, almost completely unarmed. Catherine sends an urgent message to the Swiss to force march to Meurs. The Swiss get there just in time, and the king is saved from the conspirators. The court and the Swiss retreat to the capital, closely followed by the Protestants. Since Condé and Coligny had time to prepare, they have the superior forces. But even this is not enough to besiege Paris, so Condé instead contents himself to blockade the city. However, Paris is well stocked with supplies, so the royalists stand firm. Soon, they gather more soldiers and go on the offensive. The two armies meet at Saint-Denis, just outside Paris, on the 10th of November 1567. The royalists are commanded by Montmorency, and have 3,000 cavalry, 6,000 Swiss pikemen, and 10,000 hastily gathered city militia. The Protestants only have 2,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry, however their soldiers are all professionals. After a brief artillery duel, the Huguenot cavalry led by Coligny falls on the royalist left. Montmorency's troops are still disorganized, and the Parisian militiamen rout on first contact. Seeing this, Condé attacks the center. His ferocious charge breaks through the Catholic lines. Montmorency is mortally wounded and evacuated from the battlefield. But after this initial shock, the royalists rally. Both sides resume their initial positions, and by nightfall the Protestants melt away. They retreat with high hopes, because they know that reinforcements are coming. Frederick III, the Elector Palatine, is a fervent believer in the Catholic conspiracy. With covert funds coming from England, he equips a large army of writers and lanzknechts to help the Huguenots. In December, his son, John Casimir, leads this army into France. The Catholic army is now nominally under the command of the king's younger brother, Henry, Duke of Anjou, who is assisted by Tavannes, the governor of Burgundy. They try to catch up with Condé, but the Protestants slip away. In January 1568, Condé manages to join up with John Casimir. Now the royalists become disheartened and take up defensive positions while waiting for more reinforcements. Soon immense forces gather on both sides, but none of them is willing to engage, as memories of Dreux are still weighing heavy on their minds. With no battle on the horizon, dwindling funds and the country in ruins, reason inevitably prevails. The Peace of Longjumeau is negotiated in March, ending the Second War of Religion. But Longjumeau is merely a reiteration of the previous peace, and thus doesn't solve anything. Lawlessness and violence only increase, and more Catholic and Protestant leagues are formed. Demobilization proceeds slowly, especially for the royalists. After the Protestants complacently let all their soldiers go, the royalist side decides to retain a sizable force. Since Montmorency's death, the Guises, represented by the young Duke and the Cardinal of Lorraine, have gotten closer to power. They have no intention to let the Protestants off the hook. To this end, they preemptively occupy the Loire Valley, the main area of contention in the previous wars. They are encouraged in this by Spain, Philip II promising large reinforcements if the French finally decide to destroy heresy. Events are going well for Alba in the Low Countries, as he appears to have crushed the malcontents. In June 1568, the Counts of Egmont and Hoorn are executed. This news is received in France with consternation. With such high-ranking Calvinists on the chopping block, the French parallels are inevitably drawn. When Condé and Coligny find out that their lives are in danger, they flee to the Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle. Countless numbers of their co-religionists follow them, as La Rochelle becomes the new Huguenot capital. The Royalists already have considerable forces in the field. They position one contingent to guard Orléans, and another further south to block the Protestants from getting German support. By autumn, a stalemate sets in, and the winter is spent with inactivity, as both sides are waiting for reinforcements. The Protestants in La Rochelle receive considerable help from English privateers. They also make a pact with the leaders of the Dutch Calvinists, the Prince of Orange and his brother Louis of Nassau. In December 1568, after a failed invasion of the Low Countries, Orange leads his army into the northeast of France, knowing full well that any Huguenot victory will strengthen his own side. Now the Catholics have to split their forces once more to block the Dutch rebels in Picardy. They are somewhat compensated by Spanish and German reinforcements that arrive early next year. While this was going on in the north, a different kind of fight was happening in the south. In this hilly country that was always prone to heresy, Huguenot guerrillas ruled the field. The so-called Army of the Viscounts is led by none other than the Count of Montgomery, the very man who mortally wounded Henry II. Montgomery maneuvers carefully with his ragtag army of volunteers, defeating the Catholic armies at every turn. By 1569, the Catholics in the south only hold parts of Provence and the cities of Bordeaux and Toulouse. Now the logical step is for Condé to sally from La Rochelle to unite with this southern army. The Protestants soon set out with a large force, aiming to avoid the Royalist army. But the Catholics successfully pursue them and catch up with the Huguenot rearguard at Jarnac on the 13th of March 1569. In a swift and bloody engagement, the Protestants are routed, and the Prince of Condé is captured when his horse falls. Moments later, he is shot execution style, no doubt in revenge for the assassination of the Duke of Guise. As a result, Coligny becomes the leader of the Protestants. In spite of the defeat at Jarnac, all is not lost. Coligny manages to escape with most of his army. Once in the south, he begins to reorganize his forces, encouraging them with the news of another German army that is gathering to relieve them. Indeed, by summer the Germans are once more ready to march. Wolfgang of Zweibrücken advances into France with lightning speed, capturing La Charité on the Loire. Zweibrücken dies shortly after, but his army manages to link up with the Huguenots. In sharp contrast to the Protestants, by this time the Catholic army is in a sorry state. Its soldiers are unpaid, famished and stricken by plague. Unable to stand in battle, they are content to shadow the Protestant army. But on June 25th, at La Roche-l'Abeille, an attempt to skirmish goes terribly wrong. Royalist musketeers are sent out without support and in a rainstorm. As their firearms are useless in the rain, they are massacred to the last man by charging Protestant cavalry. With this defeat, the royal army has no other recourse but to retreat to the Loire. Instead of pursuing them, Coligny decides to lay siege to Poitiers. But Poitiers is defended energetically by the young Duke of Guise all the way from July to September. The Protestant army wastes away, and by autumn the royal army is ready to fight. As they move to relieve Poitiers, Coligny is compelled to lift the siege. He tries to retreat south, but on October 3rd, 1569, the Catholic army catches up at Moncontour. Coligny tries to slip away, but a mutiny among his lanzknechts delays him for 2 hours. This gives enough time for the royalist army to deploy to block him. Now the Protestants are forced to give battle. The Catholic army is larger, with 8,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry, made up of French, Swiss, German and Spanish contingents. The Protestants only have 6,000 cavalry and 12,000 infantry. The battle starts with a cannonade that targets mostly the infantry. The first move is made by the Catholic right, who fall on the Protestant left. In the vicious melee, Coligny has to divert reserves from his right flank. The Protestants manage to push the Catholics back, but in a fight with royalist reiters, Coligny is wounded and forced to retreat. Next, the Duke of Anjou leads a cavalry charge against the Huguenot right. The attack nearly fails, but then the Catholics send in the reserve. The Protestant reiters fall on the Swiss in an attack that is doomed to fail. As they withdraw, they leave the Protestant lanzknechts dangerously exposed. Seeing disaster unfold, Coligny orders a general retreat. The cavalry manages to disengage, but the infantry is trapped. The Swiss furiously attack the lanzknechts and massacre them nearly to the last man. For good measure, they also cut down much of the French infantry. The Protestant losses are enormous, with 8,000 killed or captured. The Catholics barely lose 1,000 men. Nonetheless, the Catholics fail to exploit this stunning victory. Coligny is allowed to flee south. Instead of pursuing them, the royal army engages itself in ruinous sieges around La Rochelle. But all this achieves is to degrade the Catholic army, while Coligny replenishes his forces in the south. The winter is spent with fruitless negotiations between Catherine of Medici and Jeanne d'Albret, the Queen of Navarre, who represents the House of Bourbon until Henry of Navarre becomes a major. She asks Catherine for 4 security towns where the Protestants could maintain an armed force. For now, her request is refused, but as spring turns into summer, the balance of power is reversed. The king is utterly bankrupt and fails to field an army on time. In contrast, Coligny's forces have been replenished and are now joined by the army of the Viscounts. Coligny first tries to besiege Toulouse, but later changes his mind. He concludes that only by threatening Paris can he gain an advantageous peace. Therefore, he sets out to the east and then pushes north along the Rhone Valley, pushing deep into Burgundy. Local forces are brushed aside as Coligny's forces appear unstoppable. A royal army is hastily cobbled together and faces the Protestants at Arnay-le-Duc on June 15, 1570. In spite of their numeric superiority, the Catholics fail to stop the Huguenot army. With the prospect of another blockade of Paris, Charles IX is persuaded to negotiate. By the Treaty of Saint-Germain, the previous liberties of the Protestants are confirmed, and additionally they get 4 security towns where they can be in charge and maintain an army. Thus, from now on, armed peace will become the norm. The Catholic conspiracy that was a myth before now turns into a reality. France's civil war has thus developed into a truly international European conflict. It's 1570. The conclusion of the last war brought neither peace nor reconciliation. The Protestants achieved a very advantageous settlement at Saint-Germain and are now triumphant. The Guises are sidelined and Catholics end up embittered towards the government. Violence and crime continue unabated as the armed peace of partisan leagues becomes the norm. The country is impoverished, hungry, and close to the boiling point. Catherine endeavours to solve these problems the only way she knows, by playing off one faction against the other. Catherine believes that Spanish intervention is the greatest danger to the kingdom. To counteract this influence of Spain and the Guise, she decides to enable the other side. To this end, she proposes 2 marriages. The Duke of Anjou is to marry Queen Elizabeth, and her daughter Margaret is to marry Henry Bourbon, the King of Navarre. This way, Catherine hopes to achieve a balance of power at home, and an English alliance to counter Spanish pressure abroad. In the end, the first proposal fails, as Elizabeth I refuses to commit. However, the marriage of Margaret and Navarre is given the go-ahead. While Catherine is busy securing the future of her dynasty, more radical solutions to the Spanish problem are being discussed. The Protestants led by Coligny reasoned that it would be a sin not to exploit Spain's troubles in the Low Countries. War would be the logical step, and immensely profitable. Coligny assures the king that if he promises religious tolerance, the Dutch Calvinists will throw open their gates and welcome him as a liberator. Serious steps are now taken to raise an army, before Catherine finds out and vetoes the plan. This proves to be a wise move, since on October 7, 1571, Philip II's fleet crushes the Ottomans at Lepanto. Spain has been waging an on and off war in the Mediterranean for decades. This victory proves decisive, meaning Philip can concentrate his attention on the Netherlands. Consequently, Charles IX backtracks and bans any and all intervention in the Low Countries. But the tables are turned early next year. On April 1st, 1572, Dutch privateers calling themselves the Sea Beggars capture the fortified city of Brielle. This way, the Dutch rebels gain a strategically important port, allowing them to extend their offensive. Soon the Spanish are on the back foot, as more and more towns and cities fall to the Protestants. In spite of the king's express orders not to intervene, Louis of Nassau, who stayed behind in France, decides to do precisely that. At the head of a small band of volunteers, he crosses into Flanders in early summer and captures a few towns. Coligny insists that the crown must exploit this golden opportunity. To make his point clear, he starts to raise soldiers to widen the intervention. But then, in July 1572, one of these bands of volunteers runs into the Spanish army, who massacres them. The Genlis affair proves to be very embarrassing, implicating the king himself in a direct attack on Spain. The Spanish retort with stern threats of an all-out war if the trend continues. War is far from what Charles or Catherine wanted, but events quickly escalate beyond their control. Coligny doubles down and gives the king an ultimatum: war against Spain or civil war. The long-awaited wedding is held under these auspices on August the 18th, 1572. Paris is filled to the brim with persons of note from all over France. The Protestants come in large numbers, all dressed in black. Besides Navarre, Coligny and the young Prince of Condé are also here. The Guise likewise come with a large retinue. Throughout the city, open calls to violence can already be heard, but nonetheless the wedding goes on without any major issues. 4 days of lavish celebration follow. Much to the displeasure of the Queen Mother, Coligny uses this time to pressure the king to take action against Spain. On August 22nd, while walking home from a meeting in the Louvre to his nearby quarters, Coligny is struck in the arm by a musket ball. The would-be assassin manages to get away, however it is established that he fired from a house owned by the Guise. The wounded Coligny demands an explanation. Charles and Catherine visit him and solemnly vow to find the culprits. An inquiry is opened the next day, however events take a different turn. In the evening it's decided to finish what was begun. The king, Catherine and the Guise conspire to murder Coligny and the Protestant leaders. They reason that war is now inevitable. Armed groups of Protestants are gathered around Paris, waiting for a signal from Coligny to invade the city. By decapitating the leadership, they will gain the advantage in the coming war. To this end, a commando headed by the Duke of Guise, and made up of his own bodyguards and Swiss mercenaries, descends on Coligny's house. Henry of Guise personally stabs the admiral. Coligny is beheaded, and his body is thrown from the window, to be desecrated and paraded around the streets. Other Protestant leaders suffer the same fate, their lifeless bodies being displayed on the gibbet. Catherine and the Guise are satisfied, but the bloodshed continues. Taking a cue from their king, bands of Catholic soldiers and civilians go on the hunt for Protestants. Men, women, and children are killed without distinction. The Huguenots are easily identified by their distinctive black clothing. Checkpoints are set up to trap the ones who are trying to flee. During the following days, 3,000 Huguenots are killed in Paris. The king issues several decrees calling for calm, but in the end the authorities impotently stand by. Very few people manage to escape. Navarre and Condé are spared, on the condition that they convert to Catholicism. The massacre in Paris is followed by several regional killings. Governors and local lords claim to execute the king's will when they order thousands of Protestants to be put to the sword. In spite of further calls to calm, massacres keep happening for months. What started as a coup against the troublesome Huguenot leadership turns into a genocide. For every Huguenot killed, 10 are forced to renounce their faith. Many flee abroad, never to return to France. Protestant communities in the north are greatly weakened. Those in the south fare somewhat better. The actual war starts in September 1572, when La Rochelle refuses to pay taxes. The king immediately starts to raise an army, but being penniless, this is easier said than done. The Swiss and even the Germans give Charles the cold shoulder. Without proper soldiers, the royalist offensive takes months to materialise. December and February are mostly spent with marshalling supplies. A smaller army goes to besiege Sancerre, while Anjou heads to La Rochelle with the main force. The port city of La Rochelle is fortified with high curtain walls and medieval towers. However, during the wars, Italian-styled angled bastions had been erected at key points. The people of La Rochelle have every reason to fight. Some of them went all the way to Brazil to seek religious freedom. Being turned out from the French colony of France Antarctique, they came back only to be murdered by their own king. Surrender is out of the question now. Luckily for them, the slow mobilization of the Royal Army gave them ample time to prepare. English ships commanded by Montgomery regularly run the blockade. By the end of January, Anjou finally manages to close down the harbour. By April, a breach is made, and the royalist trenches reach the moat of La Rochelle. 8 assaults are launched against the walls, all being repulsed by dogged resistance and enfilading fire from the neighbouring bastions. The Royal Army suffers horrendous casualties that are compounded by bad weather and disease. In May, the Protestants manage to sneak in a ship laden with gunpowder. The Catholics in turn are reinforced by 6,000 Swiss. The siege reaches its climax in June. Anjou throws everything against the breach, however the Protestants anticipate the attack and they are prepared. An inner wall had been erected just behind the breach, providing an ideal killing field for the Huguenot musketeers. This attack is also beaten back, and Anjou becomes exasperated. He is saved from embarrassment by a most unlikely event. Poland's ruling dynasty had just died out, and when forced to choose between 2 Habsburgs and a Valois, the Polish nobility picked the Frenchman. Having been chosen to be the king of an exotic country gives Anjou the perfect pretext to lift the siege. The Peace of La Rochelle, a very unfavourable one for the Protestants, is signed in June 1573, concluding the Fourth War. But peace is only achieved on paper. Lawlessness is at its highest level since the start of the conflict. Harsh taxes and famine lead to peasant revolts all over the country. Catholic and Huguenot lords are killed alike, the peasants blaming the upper classes for the continuation of the war. Meanwhile, in towns and cities, the various leagues gain ever more ground. It only takes a few months, until February 1574, for the war to resume. Huguenot insurgents seize several towns in the north, south and centre of the country. The king musters 3 small armies to deal with the guerrillas. The group in the north receives special attention, as this one is led by Montgomery. Eventually, Montgomery surrenders in the hope that he will be treated fairly. But when Catherine lays her hands on her husband's killer, Montgomery is beheaded without mercy. The other 2 expeditions make less progress. Each time they attack, the Protestants retreat to their fortified towns, leading to costly and protracted sieges. But war is only one of Charles's problems. The king is stricken with consumption, and his health deteriorates by the day. In this desperate state, he has to face a new political party, that of the malcontents. The malcontents are tired of the corrupt and sectarian ways of the older generation. One of their leaders is the Duke of Alençon, the king's youngest brother. Besides his liberal political views, Alençon is also motivated by dynastic ambition. Since his older brother Henry is occupied in Poland, he would like to be first in the line of succession to the French throne. As this would disproportionately favour the Protestants, Catherine makes sure that the crown goes to her favourite son, Henry. After Charles IX dies on May 30th, 1574, she immediately assumes governorship and places Alençon and Navarre under house arrest. Henry III leaves Poland in a haste and arrives to France early in 1575. Being a distant and irresponsible king, Henry proves to be even less popular than Charles had been. The south of the country is already in open rebellion, with the Huguenots setting up a state within a state. The region's governor, Henry of Montmorency-Damville, Anne de Montmorency's son, is one of the malcontents. He rejects the new king and sides with the Protestants instead. Now Henry has no other choice but to turn to the Guise, who already act as proxies of Spain. His troubles intensify when Alençon and later Navarre escape from the court. The two have thousands of followers who rally to their side. Condé, who escaped earlier, is already in Germany recruiting an army. As the coalition's forces bear down on him, Henry III is only left in control of the area around Paris and the west of the country. Faced with impossible odds, the king is forced to sue for peace. The Edict of Beaulieu is signed in May 1576, concluding the Fifth War. This is the most advantageous peace so far for the Protestants. They can now pray anywhere except in Paris, and receive 8 security towns where they can maintain an armed force. An Estates Générales where Catholics and Protestants would be equally represented is also announced. But signing a peace is one thing, implementing it is an entirely different matter. It's 1576. France is at peace after the Edict of Beaulieu, but the country is more divided than ever. Catholics are outraged at the unprecedented concessions granted to the Protestants. Many have lost faith in their king, whom they view as a weakling, unable or unwilling to defend them. The last straw, as they see it, is the granting of the governorship of Picardy to Condé. This is obviously a Huguenot plot to link up with the Calvinist Dutch rebels, therefore it must be stopped at all costs. To this end, the Catholics set up a powerful regional league to defend themselves from Protestant encroachment. Seemingly overnight, a series of similar Catholic leagues are formed all over the east, north and centre of the country. The king at first is taken by surprise, but then quickly decides to preempt trouble by seizing the initiative. For this reason, Henry organises an Estates Générales at Blois, but almost all the delegates who arrive are Catholic. Initially, the king proposes reforms, however all the delegates want to hear about is war. Therefore, Henry changes his tone, and confesses that he himself would like to attain better terms. But war is a costly matter, and he will need money. At this point, the Estate lets him down, offering only a paltry sum for the war. When the offensive starts in 1577, Henry has barely enough money for 4 months. Consequently, after a few minor sieges, the offensive staggers to a halt. Unable to take action, the king is forced to make peace with the Huguenots. The Peace of Bergerac is signed in September 1577, ushering in 7 years that will be almost free of war. But the absence of major actions does not mean an end to hostilities. Small-scale war is now endemic in France. Bands of soldiers in the hire of particular lords roam the countryside, ambushing and skirmishing with opposing bands, laying waste to the meagre belongings of the commoners left and right. Violent peasant revolts break out in the affected regions, with the peasants themselves forming war bands to attack the nobility. War, pestilence, and failed harvests bring France to its lowest point. Unperturbed by this, Alençon, who has since been promoted to Duke of Anjou, is still on a quest for personal glory. Eager to prove himself, he organizes a small force and proceeds to invade the Low Countries. Once there, the Dutch rebels promise him everything, including the crown, the only condition being that he himself has to remove the Spanish. But Anjou is penniless, and he can't count on support from Henry or Catherine, who have been opposed to this project from the start. Undaunted, Anjou goes to England and proposes to Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth, who has dealt with much bigger men than Anjou, rejects him after a brief lead-up. Dejected and disabused, Anjou returns to France a broken man. Meanwhile, France reaches the boiling point once more. The seventh and shortest war breaks out in November 1579. The cause is the same as in the previous war. Condé tries to claim the governorship of Picardy, and the Catholics go out of their way to prevent this. Hostilities also break out in the south, but the war peters out after a few minor sieges. Most Protestants don't want a war, and will be content with the reaffirmation of their rights. Henry obliges, and guarantees those rights provided by the Edict of Beaulieu. Unsurprisingly, the Catholics are greatly displeased by this. The casual violence of a peaceful period simmers on for 4 more years, before things finally come to a head. Anjou dies on June the 10th, 1584. This means that unless Henry III produces an heir, the throne will fall to Henry of Navarre. Since the king is not interested in women, and longevity is also not on his side, a Calvinist king is almost a certainty now. Henry III tries to compromise by inviting Henry of Navarre to adopt Catholicism. When Navarre refuses, Henry of Guise feels compelled to act. Thus commences the longest and bloodiest episode of the conflict, the War of the Three Henrys. Catholic leagues all over France agree to unite under the leadership of the Guise. Realizing that it's now or never, Spain offers its full support. On the last day of 1584, in great secrecy, the Treaty of Joinville is signed between the Catholic League and Spain. The League promises to recognize the elderly Cardinal of Bourbon, Navarre's uncle, as the rightful heir to the throne. Additionally, the Guise promise to adopt the findings of the Council of Trent into law, and also to end France's alliance with the Ottomans. In return, Spain offers full financial and military support. Immediately, the League springs into action. Their forces suddenly seize control in the north, the east, and the centre of the country. The king's first reaction is to declare war, but he's dissuaded by Catherine, who advocates for negotiations instead. While the talks are going on, the Guise take steps to consolidate their power. In March 1585, they publish the Manifesto of Péronne. In the manifesto, they outline the grim future that would await Catholics if the state became Protestant. If nothing is done, atrocities will surely follow. Additionally, they recommend that the Estates Generales should meet 3 times a year, that taxes should be lowered, and that parallel to this, the war should be renewed. This appeal garners them even more support. Countless towns and cities side with the League, since they see it as the last chance to stop the Huguenot fanatics. Most notably, Paris sides with the League. While still nominally under the control of the king, in private most of the city and its officials have already sided with the Guise. A secretive organization of Catholic zealots, the Committee of the 16, named after the 16 districts of Paris, is set up around this time. The 16 infiltrate every major organization of the city, poised to take on the king whenever the opportunity should arise. Faced with these impossible odds, Henry III is forced to concede. In July 1585, the Treaty of Namur is concluded between the king and the League. The document strips Protestants of all rights and privileges granted to them since the start of the war. It also lays down strict laws against heresy, to be enforced by the League and paid for by the king. Furthermore, the Catholics too would receive a number of security towns where they could maintain a permanent army. Thus humiliated, Henry withdraws for a time, leaving political matters to his mother and the war to the League. Bolstered by Spanish silver, the Catholic League goes on the offensive in 1586. Small-scale sieges and skirmishes make up the initial actions. Henry of Navarre and the Protestants are taken by surprise and adopt a defensive position. They ask for help from the usual places: Queen Elizabeth and their longtime backers in Germany, Frederick III, Elector Palatine, and his son John Casimir. By 1587, a large army of Germans and Swiss is being raised in the Palatinate from money supplied by the English. Faced with foreign intervention, the king determines to take to the field. He puts together a large force and stations it in the Loire Valley. As his first move, Henry sends a sizable advance guard led by one of his favourites, the Duke of Joyeuse, to engage the dwindling forces of Navarre. Navarre plans to sally from La Rochelle and move south where he can gather more men and await the arrival of the Germans. Joyeuse is determined to intercept him. He achieves this on the 20th of October 1587. Unable to retreat, Navarre offers him battle near the village of Coutras. The two forces are almost evenly matched, with Navarre having 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry, while Joyeuse commands 5,000 infantry and 1,800 cavalry. Navarre anchors his left flank on the village, and his right flank on a forested area. He arranges his cavalry in the center and his infantry on the flanks. However, he also positions small groups of musketeers among his cavalry, whom he orders to fire only when the enemy is a few paces away. Additionally to tactical innovations, Navarre also implemented technological changes. His gendarmes no longer charge with a lance, instead they use a pair of pistols. This offers them an advantage in the countercharge, since they can now inflict damage first on those who charge them, then attack the stunned enemy with swords. Joyeuse falls into this trap with gusto. After a brief artillery bombardment that mostly affects the Catholics, Joyeuse orders his left flank to engage the Huguenot right. His cavalry charges its opposing number and achieves limited success. Meanwhile, his infantry engages the Protestant foot. The Huguenots stand firm and repulse this initial attack. Next, Joyeuse orders all his cavalry to charge. By the time they reach the Protestant lines, they become disorganized. They are met with devastating fire that in an instant decimates them and puts them to flight. Now the Protestants charge in with swords, cutting down anyone who isn't fast enough. In the end, 2,000 Catholics, including the commander himself, lie dead on the battlefield. The Protestants suffer minimal casualties. After obtaining this stunning victory, instead of mounting a pursuit, Navarre unremarkably decides to stay put and wait for the Germans. Indeed, the Germans were mobilizing throughout the summer of 1587. John Casimir decides to give the command to Fabian von Dohna. According to Navarre's orders, Dohna is to march straight to the Huguenot south to join up with him as soon as possible. But instead, Dohna makes an extended stop in Lorraine, pondering whether he should loot the duchy or not. After this, he marches his force due northwest towards Paris. While the king remains stationary with the main force, Henry of Guise is sent with a scant force to stop the 7,000 Germans, 12,000 Swiss, and 2,000 French in the expedition. Remarkably, he manages to do this. On the 26th of October 1587, he falls on the German camp in a daring night attack. This skirmish doesn't achieve much, but it does demoralize an already confused enemy. Soon enough, the Swiss are paid off, leaving the Germans to stand alone. Nonetheless, Dohna pushes on all the way to the town of Auneau. He settles into the town and begins to plan his next move. Unbeknownst to him, Henry of Guise hid musketeers within the town, while he himself lays an ambush outside the walls. On the 24th of November, as Dohna prepares to leave the town, Guise pounces on him. The Germans are routed and barely manage to regroup. Seeing that the Duke of Guise is just days away from an absolute victory, the king decides to intervene. He bribes the Germans to leave, promising them safe passage, hoping that this way he can minimize Guise's contribution. Having dealt with this problem, Henry III returns to Paris. But as the news of Guise's stunning victory and the pitiful defeat of his favourite reaches the city, Henry discovers that his popularity among Parisians is close to zero. Worst of all, the Duke of Guise demands the governorship of Normandy in return for his services. Henry III deems this excessive, as he considers the Guise already powerful enough. To stave off trouble, the king banishes the Duke from Paris. Little does he know that a terrific plot is already being hatched against him. It's 1588. Tensions are high. Paris is like a hornet's nest after the recent developments. Henry of Guise demands the governorship of Normandy as a reward for serving his country, but the king cannot allow the Guise to gain even more power, therefore the request is denied. Even worse, the Duke is banished from the capital, and the governorship is given to the king's other lackey, the Duke of Epernon. This is an affront Henry of Guise cannot accept. In May 1588, he enters Paris anyway, followed by a large retinue. The city's gates are thrown open, and Guise is welcomed by cheering crowds. By now, the capital is de facto under the control of the Committee of the 16. The militia is on their side, and the king's orders are being openly defied. Catherine of Medici feels compelled to cozy up to the League. However, Henry III is already planning his counter-move. On the 11th of May, the king orders several battalions of Swiss into the capital. This is a big mistake. Having foreign troops in Paris is something unheard of. Instigated by the 16, the Parisian mob begins to erect barricades. The Swiss try to restore order, but the militiamen overwhelm them by sheer numbers. Guise considers the situation and decides to offer the king a way out. On May 13th, the Swiss are allowed to leave, followed by Henry III shortly after. Now, the Guise are at the height of their power. The League rules the better part of the country, and the 16 officially take charge in Paris. More pressure is put on the king to obtain further concessions. In July 1588, Henry is forced to sign the Edict of Union, a radical document promising the extermination of Protestantism. The king also pledges to dismiss Epernon and give Normandy to the Guise. Most importantly, he agrees to name the Cardinal of Bourbon as his heir. The League's coup is carefully timed to coincide with another major move, the deployment of the Spanish Armada. In July, more than 100 Spanish vessels form an impenetrable wall of wood stretching for miles in the English Channel. They are tasked with picking up the Duke of Parma and a large army of veterans who are intended to invade England. With his flank secured by the Catholic League, Philip II believes he can pull this off. But the English are led by the most skillful sailors of the day, John Hawkins and Francis Drake. The English take advantage of the winds and use an age-old tactic against the Spanish: fire ships. With this ploy, the Armada is scattered and forced to sail around the British Isles. Parma has to stay put, and the invasion of England is called off. Protestants all across Europe rejoice. Henry III also gains courage and decides to reclaim the initiative. First, he tries to subvert the League at the Estates Generales, but to his dismay, he finds out that most of the delegates are supporters of the League. Undaunted, the king determines that harsher measures are needed. The Guise have to be taken care of St. Bartholomew style. On the 23rd of December 1588, as soon as he enters the king's chambers, Henry of Guise is stabbed to death. The similarities between this and the fate that befell Coligny 16 years earlier are not lost to the Leaguers. The areas controlled by Catholics explode with rage. Henry of Guise had been their saviour, the last chance to maintain the country's integrity. Now that he's gone, Henry's brother, the Duke of Mayenne, is put in overall charge, and the Catholics become even more radical. The king is chased out of his realm, and only controls a few towns in the Loire Valley. Catherine of Medici dies in January, leaving him even more exposed. He is out of options now. He cannot let the Guise get away. However, being powerless himself, he will need allies to reclaim his country. Henry III has no other choice but to make a pact with Henry of Navarre. The Treaty of Plessis-les-Tours is signed in April 1589. The king and the Protestants join their forces and strike at the heart of the League, Paris. Paris is too large to be taken by storm, so the Allies surround the city in order to starve it out. Catholics within the city become even more radical. Moderates and royalists are purged. Henry III is declared the devil incarnate. Those who were loyal subjects of the crown just 10 years ago are now fierce republicans. Many preachers call for the death of the king. One man among the crowd, a Dominican friar, decides to take things into his own hands. On August 1st, 1589, claiming that he is a deserter carrying important messages, the friar mortally stabs the king. As Henry III lays dying, he names Navarre as his successor and urges him to convert to Catholicism for the sake of the nation. Navarre refuses this for now. In response, the Leaguers concoct elaborate theories to confirm the Cardinal of Bourbon's primacy to the throne. The siege of Paris continues, but as the weeks go by, more and more men desert from Navarre. He has to lift the siege eventually, and begins his retreat to Normandy. Navarre marches to Dieppe, where he hopes to receive reinforcements from England. Seeing that Navarre is on the back foot, Mayenne sallies from Paris with a large force. He follows Navarre all the way to Dieppe. He needs to capture the town before English reinforcements can arrive. However, to do this, he has to cross a marshy river at the small village of Arques. Navarre is already prepared, laying out his forces in 2 trenches that block the only crossing. He barely has 5,000 soldiers compared to Mayenne's 24,000. This overwhelming superiority in numbers makes Mayenne overconfident. He walks into Navarre's trap with full conviction. On the 21st of September 1589, as a dense fog settles over the battlefield, Mayenne makes his first move. He sends forth a battalion of Germans who pretend to be deserters. The men in the first trench take the bait. The Germans suddenly turn on them, as Mayenne himself launches a cavalry assault. The League's forces manage to overwhelm the first trench. However, when they get to the second trench, they are welcomed with murderous fire. The fog suddenly clears, allowing the gunners in the fortress of Arques a clear view. Now the League's forces receive devastating flanking fire, in addition to being shot at from the trench. This is too much for Mayenne's forces, and they give up the battle. Mayenne tries to take the crossing a few more times, however Navarre manages to hold on to his positions. Soon reinforcements arrive from England and from the south of France. Now Mayenne has to retreat and Navarre follows. The League's forces regroup in Paris. Meanwhile, Navarre preoccupies himself with small sieges around the capital. He blockades Paris during November, however his forces are insufficient to prevent reinforcements from reaching the city. The siege becomes futile, so Navarre returns to winter quarters. Hostilities resume in the spring of 1590. Navarre approaches the capital and draws the League army to the northwest. The two armies meet on the 14th of March 1590 at the village of Ivry. Navarre is again outnumbered with 11,000 soldiers against the League's 16,000. Both sides arrange their forces in mixed blocks of cavalry and infantry. Again, the main difference is that while the League's cavalry still charges with a lance, Navarre's cavalry are all pistoliers. The first move is made by League cavalry who charge Navarre's lines. The initial engagement is soon joined by more cavalry squadrons in the centre. Henry of Navarre personally enters the fray, putting his life at risk to achieve victory. When Navarre's reserve charges into the flanks, the League centre begins to unravel. Mayenne has to retreat, leaving behind a great number of dead and wounded. Navarre remains stationary for 2 weeks, then moves to besiege the capital for a second time. Even though the defenders outnumber the attackers, given the last battles, the League's forces are reluctant to venture out of their defensive positions. But Paris is ill prepared for the 4-month siege. Stockpiles of food soon dwindle, and the defenders begin to eat dogs and horses. By August 1590, 30,000 people, a tenth of the city's population, die of starvation. But they still refuse to surrender because they know that relief is on its way. The The Duke of Parma, Philip II's best general in the Low Countries, is already on the march to relieve Paris. As Parma nears the capital, Navarre is forced to detach part of his army to block the Spanish. Parma refuses to engage, and as more and more besiegers are funneled from the siege, a group of Spanish cavalry manages to sneak across the lines to bring supplies to Paris. Navarre realizes that the siege is pointless, therefore he disengages and splits up his army to do minor tasks. By the spring of 1591, Navarre is very short on funds, so he has to disband most of his army. Meanwhile, the League becomes divided. The 16 are increasingly unpopular, as they become too radical even for the hardliners. Therefore, Mayenne launches a coup and deposes the 16, taking over leadership in Paris himself. While this was going on, the League's political position became even more untenable. In May 1590, the Cardinal of Bourbon dies, stripping the League's arguments of all plausibility. To keep up the spirit, new candidates are proposed, such as Mayenne, the young Duke of Guise, or even Philip II. But none of these candidates inspire any enthusiasm, and the League rapidly loses momentum. By autumn 1591, Navarre receives funds from England and the Dutch, and hires a large army of Germans. More reinforcements arrive from England, and Navarre goes on the offensive. In November, he commences the siege of Rouen, in the hope that by capturing it, he can cut off Paris from the sea. The defenders of Rouen endure the siege for months, knowing well that, as before, relief is on its way. The Duke of Parma invades once more, and arrives before Rouen in January 1592. Navarre dispatches his cavalry to delay the Spanish, but Parma repulses their attack. A series of maneuvers follow, and as Parma crosses the Seine to conduct a siege, Navarre also crosses in the hope that he can trap the Spanish between the river and the sea. But Parma quickly builds a pontoon bridge, and just as Navarre is planning his final move, he evacuates his forces across the river. After this, Parma force marches to Paris and reinforces the garrison with Spanish soldiers before heading back to the Netherlands. But by 1593, all parties are tired of war. Hunger, banditry, pestilence, and peasant revolts reach a record level. Both sides are in low spirits, as fighting seems to go on forever with no end in sight. To resolve the impasse, an Estat General is called. Various candidates are proposed for the throne, including the Spanish Infanta. However, by now, most Catholics are distrustful of Spain. They would like law and order to prevail, but they would also require a Catholic king. Consequently, Henry of Navarre is approached again about his religion. After lengthy negotiations, Navarre finally agrees to convert. In July 1593, he becomes a Catholic. By doing this, he removes the final obstacle that prevented him from claiming the throne. Henry IV is crowned in February 1594. In March, he enters Paris nearly unopposed. But convincing all his countrymen and removing the Spanish threat will take time. In 1595, Henry moves against the rebels in Burgundy. They are defeated in spite of Spanish support. Mayenne capitulates after a sizable bribe is paid. But meanwhile, the Spanish seize the northern city of Amiens. Now, Henry marches to the north and ousts the Spanish by 1597. Peace with Spain is achieved in 1598. After some more campaigns and more bribes, the last remnants of the Catholic League are eliminated in the same year. In an attempt to achieve a lasting peace, the now Catholic Henry proposes a religious compromise to his Protestant comrades. The Edict of Nantes is proclaimed on April 30th, 1598. The treaty allows free worship everywhere where Protestantism already exists. The Huguenots receive scores of security towns, they can hold offices, and their priests and soldiers are to be paid by the state. On the other hand, the Catholic Church's property has to be restored, and Huguenots too will have to pay the tithe, as well as their other taxes. Also, they will not be allowed to form any political associations. The peace is first treated with skepticism by the population. Radicals on both sides are unsatisfied, but war is averted during Henry IV's reign. Military battles are moved to the courts of law. However, in this seeming peace, resistance is fermenting under the surface. Henry IV is assassinated by a radical Catholic in 1610. Shortly after, a religious war breaks out. After a hard-fought war that culminates with the siege of La Rochelle, the Protestants lose to their king. Louis XIV takes away all their privileges and nullifies the Edict of Nantes. Most Huguenots either convert or flee abroad. Full religious toleration will only be achieved after the French Revolution. Looking at what the war achieved, we are presented with a bleak picture. By the time of Francis I and Henry II, France was on its way to becoming the strongest European state. But great nobles resented the monarchy's power and joined their cause with religion to usurp this power for themselves. Thus weakened, France is paralysed for half a century. This gives Spain and the Habsburgs unparalleled primacy. Both the Huguenots and France itself come out on the losing side. However, the war does offer Protestants an indispensable break, and this means that more religious wars are to come.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, it helps with the algorithm. Check out my Patreon if you want to help me on this journey. Links down below.